Okay, one of the things you want to consider in changing preamp tubes, going out and spending money to make your amp better, like you would change guitar strings or a microphone in your PA system, is first of all, do I have a need? And second of all, how many do I need? And I guess the most common question we get is, when do I know it's time to change my preamp tubes? Well, one answer to that might be if you don't like the sound of your amplifier. Maybe it's a little bright, a little dark. Before you modify it, before you sell it, try changing the preamp tube. It'd be a lot like saying, if I've got a speaker cabinet I don't like the sound of, you might try a different speaker in there. I got a PA system I don't like the sound of. Well, have you tried a new microphone? So when you're changing a preamp tube, you're really changing the tonality of the amplifier, not so much the feel and the response characteristic. That comes from power stage. You want a earlier distorting or later distorting power, softer, tighter, cleaner, softer, mushier. That would be a power tube decision. So we'd go with a lower or higher number rating, or we'd go with a different kind of a tube, less or more power. Preamp tubes, each of them have a function in the amplifier, and I'd like to just take a common amplifier here real quick. And you like that squeak? We can't edit that out of the audio, so you're going to have to like it. Basically, I'm going to take, let's say, a super reverb, and I'm going to take, this would be like, let's call it a 60s, so we're not talking about something new, but just something very classic. And I'm going to take a Marshall, let's call it a 50-watt head. Again, one of the classic earlier ones that makes it just simpler for the explanation. In the super reverb, you have 6 preamp tubes. And basically, every one of them is doing an independent action. When you ever look on a schematic, and in the book there you will see quite a few schematics, you'll see the tubes actually have a corresponding number to them in a sequence that they're used, and it's usually in the chain. So in other words, if your guitar signal goes in here, it's going to go first to what we call V1. So the V1 means that's the first valve, the first gain stage in the amplifier. On a super reverb, you've got 2 channels, don't you? You've got your normal channel and you got reverb channel. So V1 in a super reverb, and that would be, as you look at the back of the amplifier, I'm looking at the rear of the amp now, here's the back of the speakers. The very first tube is V1, and that's the normal channel. Why go spend out a whole bunch of money for a preamp tube in the normal channel if you never plug into that channel? Good information to have. Go spend a ton of money and put it in V2, because V2 is very likely where most people playing a super reverb plug their guitar. That's the channel that has reverb and tremolo. And it has a slightly different characteristic of sound as well, because it has more circuitry to it. So there's a 12AX7 that is in the normal channel. There's another one that's in what we would call the reverb channel here. And that tube right there is the first stage of gain in the amplifier. The most critical preamp tube in that amplifier is the first one that takes what is a very low, not even a very, very small part of a signal, and it amplifies it up to be, at this point, maybe a half a watt. From, maybe a small fraction of a watt up to a whole half a watt. So that's where our first gain stage happens, and that brings the signal up to line level. That's a lot like plugging your mic into the mixer. The mixer then, first stage that microphone hits, brings it up to what we call line level. At line level you can add effects and everything, and at line level you drive a power amp. That's a known level of energy, and that's, so our first gain stage, in this case of the super reverb, would be the second tube over. Now in a Marshall, you don't have 6 preamp tubes, you have 3 preamp tubes. And on a Marshall, basically both V1 and V2 are the first preamp tube. They just use one of those triodes for V1 and the other triode for V2. On a Marshall, the second tube over is the tone circuit. Very simple amplifier. So this is gain or volume, very important tube. Tone, less important, because most of these amplifiers that we like the sound of have passive tone controls, which means they're not actually isolating mid-range and boosting it. They're boosting the whole circuit and then filtering out areas, so they act more like filters. And as a result, it is an important tube, but not as important as the gain tube. This would be basically V3 in this circuit. And in a Fender amp, we have some more effects. As you may know, a super reverb's got reverb and tremolo. Well, one of those is the V3. This basically is the reverb drive, and an easy way to understand it is send. It's like a little effects loop. We're going to take the signal that's been passed over, we're going to send it down to the reverb spring, which lives in the box, usually in the bottom of your amplifier. And then V4, which would be next in line. This is the reverb amp, or the recovery, and basically it's going to listen to the other end of that wire and amplify it. And because it went through a long spring, you got delay. And these two together, the driver and the recovery, are your reverb circuit. And a good thing to understand here is if your reverb stops working, you may want to take a look at one of these tubes. If your reverb sounds a little thin, you want to fatten it up, you might try putting a C in there or a Mullard in there. You might have a low gain tube in your reverb. So knowing this kind of helps that. But again, it's not the most critical amp for your whole sound, it's just critical to what the reverb sounds like. The fifth tube, which would be V5 in your amplifier, is the tremolo tube. And I don't know a lot of guys using tremolo today, but I can tell you this, the best tube in the world or the worst tube in the world here, you probably won't hear any difference at all, because all it's going to do is basically act like a quick volume control. And all it's going to do is turn up and down the signal that came from V2. So it's really not going to change your sound much. My general advice is, for a guy who's retubing the super reverb, is buy 4 tubes at the most. Buy your V1 for the channel, V2 for the channel you play through, your channel that you're playing through. Maybe buy your reverb tubes, because you know you might want your reverb to have less hum, noise, microphonics, and sound cleaner. And that's a whole little circuit unto itself. So there you got a good buy on how you drive the tank and how you recover it. The tremolo tube I'd forget about. I'd forget about the normal channel. In fact, what a lot of guys don't know with the super reverb, if you pull out that first tube, everything else still works. And you actually get, if you remove it, you get a 3 dB rise in gain. Why? Because this filament is no longer draining on the filamentary supply, and that gives another 4th or 5th of the voltage to the rest of the tube, so they get a little hotter supply. So if you pull out a V1 and a super reverb amplifier, you can do that. You'll get a little bit more gain out of the other stages. That just emphasizes. The last tube is what we call a phase inverter, and it is the tube that actually drives the power tubes. And as a result, it has a whole different characteristic. It's actually impedance is an important thing there, and how it transfers the signal and drives those power tubes. It needs to be changed every single time you change power tubes, because it's really part of the power section, even though it's a preamp tube. We can get into what this is also called a matched phase inverter. You might recall earlier the sine wave, the A and the B. That tube is what splits what has been essentially a Class A signal. Each tube handling the signal, handing it off from one to the other, splitting it for divide and conquer to the Class AB output section. Super Reverb, Marshall 50, both Class AB amplifiers. So this creates the A and the B side of the sine wave. And as a result, if its triodes are identical, it's matched for that. And in groove tube language, we call that a matched phase inverter. And those are tubes that are selected for that attribute, that both triodes are identical. You will get a more even drive to your power stage. That's something relatively new in our catalog. That's been added in the last couple of years. We've been doing it for years for special customers, and we decided to add it as a feature. It takes a lot more testing and work to find one. 1 out of 20 may have matched triodes. Hard to tell. So this is basically how a super reverb works, how the preamp tubes work in there. Marshall is much simpler, 3 preamp tubes. You've got your 2 gains in one section, your tone. Its third tube over here is the phase inverter. Its V3 is also called phase inverter, or it's called driver tube because it drives the power tubes. And essentially that needs to be changed with power tubes. Let me tell you when to change a preamp tube. When it sounds bad, or when you're looking for a better sounding tube. If you get a good sounding preamp tube, it'll literally go through 20 sets of power tubes before it wears out. It has a very long life. Don't change preamp tubes unless you start to hear a lot of noise, hum, microphonics. That's a reason to change a preamp tube, a fault. If you like the sound of it, leave it alone. You're not going to necessarily get a better tube from me if you've already got a good tube. And I don't recommend spending money when you don't need to. Your power tubes wear out, however, it can be as often as 3 months or 3 years, depending on how hard you play. If you're playing with a lot of distortion in a band, if you're putting the amp, a 50 watt amp at full power, a 100 watt amp at half power, all these, it's like batteries. You know, how hard you push them is how fast they wear out. Power tubes will wear out on a regular basis, preamp tubes not. Always remember, change your phase inverter with your power section. And that's pretty what you need to know about selecting and choosing your preamp tubes. Again, let me just say, a lot more detail on each tube is included both on the website and in the book. Don't want to take a lot of time with that here. So if you need that research, go get it. It's there. Okay, preamp tubes covered. We're now going to move down the signal chain to the power tube. We told you how we match power tubes. Hey, we told you about everything. We told you how we made them. We told them what they do, how they work. Now we're going to tell you, we told you how we match them, but once you've got that 1 to 10 rating system in mind, you still have the basic attributes of the tube we're talking. We can match radial tires, or we can match bias tires. You know, they're different tires for different applications, and there's different tubes for different applications. Most American-based amplifiers, generally speaking, copied Fender. Marshall copied Fender at the very beginning. The first Marshall circuits were basically ripped right out of a 410 Bassman, which was the Tweed amplifier during the 50s that made Fender popular. Pretty much about the time when Fender had phased out the Tweed Bassman era, which was a special design of an amplifier that wasn't really necessarily invented by Fender as much as it was invented by the companies who made the tubes. They would apply the application notes. I don't want to give too much credit to anybody here, but bottom line is these are old designs. And you can use different components in that design, much like you can use a different microphone in the PA. The PA is designed to amplify anything that sticks into it. Now, the power stage of an amplifier works with power tubes, and the Fender style had used a 6L6. That was pretty much the standard of the industry, and many argue still is today. And that is basically a 6L6 power tube. This was originally invented, by the way, by RCA. Company, and they manufacture most of the tooling. In fact, we build the GE 6L6 on RCA machines here. You'll see some of those later in the video. But RCA pretty much invented the 6L6 and invented many of the tubes. It is a pentode that uses a beam forming component. That's one of these, the old megaphone effect. And then the Marshall, which used the same design as Fender, literally the amp circuit of a 410 Tweed Bassman, was one of the best sounding amps ever made. In fact, the guys at Marshall really liked that amp, and so they copied it. The very first Marshall amps did use 6L6, maybe for the first year or so, but they quickly changed to use an EL34, which was a much more commonly available pentode that was made in Europe at the time. So these are both pentodes. This uses a beam forming plate. There's the last word there. This uses a more what we call a beam forming grid, would be an easy way to understand that. Beam forming, and it's also called a suppressor grid. And that, again, focuses the electrodes, but it's a 5-component part, so it's a pentode. Now, in the family of 6L6s here, there are, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 options for you. There are several from Russia. So we have a 6L6R and an R2. This is the Sovtek version that has been around for all, and it's basically the OEM or original equipment manufacturer for Fender. There is a second version that's a smaller factory in St. Petersburg, normally known as Svetlana. However, there's a lot of confusion on this name right now, since the company that owns Sovtek, when the Svetlana distributor went out of business, it bought the name and is now making Svetlana tubes in the Sovtek factory. Very confusing. The real Svetlana now has what's called a Circle C. So I'm trying to give you the names for these as you might see them in other catalogs, or you might know that you have some Svetlana tubes. The early Svetlana tubes actually say Svetlana. The new ones are kind of like, how should we say, disguised Sovtek tubes to say Svetlana. And the Circle C is the real Svetlana. Now, the smaller Svetlana tube has a lot of fans, and that's the reason I mentioned that. It's going to be a little bit more money because they cost more. The Sovtek is probably the lowest cost, and therefore basically the OEM choice of most companies, because frankly they're selling you the grill cloth that says Fender on it, not the tube in the back. And they don't want to necessarily spend as much money as possible on tubes. They want to give a good tube, and it is a good tube, and they designed around it. But if you want to then take your stock amplifier, let's say you bought a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe with 6L6Rs. In our catalog, we call that a 6L6R. In fact, we process and match and select all the tubes in Fender amplifiers, and the majority of them, I can tell you, are made in this particular factory. A little more money, some of the boutique guys step up. The R2 is a little higher performing tube, has a brighter sound. Then we get into the Chinese tubes. Chinese tubes are probably the sweetest sounding of the low-cost tubes that are out there. C equals China, as we've talked about with preamp tubes. So the 6L6C is a very good selection if you're looking for a warmer blueser tube. That's one of our favorite tubes for blues, and that's low cost. Then there's an S, and that's for Slovakia. And they make a hot tube. I would say that's a plus, a 6L6 plus almost, because it's got a little more gain than you'd expect out of a 6L6. So it's a more aggressive, brighter tube. We have the GE that we are making now in our facility here. You'll see some of those productions here. That is an exact copy of the original GE tube, and that's made in USA. For the most part, it's about 70% USA content. Things that we don't get here anymore, we have to import, or processes that we don't do here, we have to import. And so at any rate, that's our 6L6 GE tube. And oh, by the way, we also have a KT66 HP. This is a 6L6. The European name for a 6L6, remember I mentioned they had different names. A 6L6 is also known as a 5881. Some people call it that. That's the military number. The European number could be KT66. It's also known as an EL37. These are all basically 6L6 equivalents. We use the KT66 because it is a UK made tube that we built around an original gold line KT66, interchangeable in virtually every amplifier. Very different looking tube. I actually have one over here. Let me grab one. Sorry to go off camera on you there, guys. This would be pretty much what an original 6L6 looks like when GE made it, and it's also looking just like that today, made in our production. This is the Slovakian 6L6S. See a little bit bigger plate, a little taller tube. The KT66, very different looking tube, has what we call the ST shape on the bottle, kind of got the shoulders, looks like a little like a Coke bottle. And we follow the designs of these tubes. They're all basically the same principle, but made with very different applications. Just like all 12-inch speakers might sound different, and they all might be 8 ohms, but they have different size voice coils or whatever, and that makes them different one from another. So, if you have a 6L6 choice, you've got 2 R's, a C, an S, a GE, a KT66. Golly, have I forgotten anything? Let me just check here. And you know we can do this, yes, we actually have a second variation, that's right, on a Chinese tube. We actually have a CB, which we call the Coke bottle. It is a similar 6L6, but it's made in the KT66 bottle. That's also China, but we call it CB because Coke bottle shape, so to speak. So those are choices that, like I mentioned, you have a total of 8 choices that you can choose from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and yeah, the HP, the GE, the R2, S, C. Yeah, that's 8. That's 8, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Where's 8? I know it's here somewhere. Oh yes, I'm sorry. There is a KT66. I'm sorry. C. There's a version made in China. Also a very close copy, and not a tube that we necessarily call an exclusive groove tube. This would be an exclusive groove tube. You can't get it from anybody else because we actually tool up and make the KT66, and we make this in Russia actually, at one of the original Sovtek factory. The GE is made here. Those two tubes are our tubes.